Stonehenge draws 1 million visitors a year to compare shadows and stars. Half a world away, on a quiet Victorian plain, a smaller and far older circle of stones sits almost unknown. Near the Youangs, a low range of granite hills west of Melbourne, the land flattens into open volcanic grassland. Cattle graze where basalt boulders break through the soil. Roughly 100 stones sit arranged in an egg-shaped oval, some barely knee-high, 3 larger stones anchoring its western edge. From a distance, it looks like scattered rubble. Its name is Wurdi Youang, taken from the Wurdi language of the traditional custodians of this land. Researchers have proposed the western stones point toward the setting sun on the solstices and equinox. Yet almost no one outside Australia has heard the name. No gift shop, no visitor centre, no queue of tourists with cameras. This episode follows that debate from the beginning, through colonial dismissal, decades of silence, a 21st century astronomer with a hunch, and a controversy over age that is nowhere close to settled. Some of it is solid science. The Wurdi people have held responsibility for this land for longer than written history can measure. Long before surveyors arrived with their maps and their assumptions, this ground already had meaning. Picture an elder standing among the stones at dusk, the basalt still warm from the day's sun. He knows the shape of the horizon here without needing to check it. Centuries later, a researcher walks the same ground with a notebook and a GPS unit. She kneels beside one of the western stones, tracing its angle with her eye toward the horizon. To understand how a paddock full of rocks became a genuine scientific puzzle, we have to go back more than a century, to the first colonial accounts that almost erased it entirely. European settlers arrived in the Wurdi Youang region in the 1830s, turning grazing land into sheep and cattle runs within a generation. Stone arrangements across Victoria were treated as curiosities at best, obstacles at worst. In 1881, colonial writer James Dawson published one of the first serious accounts of Aboriginal stone arrangements in his book On the Aboriginal Peoples of Western Victoria. He described structures used for ceremony, for marking territory, for purposes settlers rarely bothered to ask about. Wurdi Youang itself avoided the plough largely by accident. The ground was too rocky, too uneven, too unprofitable to farm intensively. What saved it wasn't respect. For decades, the arrangement was noted only in passing, if at all, in survey records and pastoral maps. No formal study, no protection, no name reaching the public. Colonial-era observers who did notice such arrangements often assumed they were livestock yards, boundary markers, or the accidental scatter of a lava flow. The idea that Aboriginal Australians might have built deliberate astronomical monuments simply didn't fit the assumptions of the time. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that archaeologists began systematically recording stone arrangements across Victoria at all. Even then, most received only a brief note in a survey file. Aboriginal knowledge holders, meanwhile, had never lost track of what these places meant. Oral tradition doesn't require a government file to remain intact. By the late 1970s and 1980s, a new generation of Australian archaeologists began taking Aboriginal stone arrangements more seriously as intentional cultural structures rather than accidents of geology. Wurdi Youang appeared in academic surveys but without deep analysis of what its shape might mean. The turning point came not from an archaeologist but from an astronomer. Ray Norris, a radio astronomer with Australia's National Science Agency, CSIRO, had spent his career studying galaxies. Norris had a simple question. If this arrangement really was shaped like an egg with specific stones marking its edges, could those stones be pointing at something in the sky? It was the kind of question an astronomer, not a farmer, would think to ask. He teamed up with Dwayne Hamaker, a specialist in Aboriginal astronomy, to actually measure the site properly. Together, they surveyed the position of every major stone with modern instruments. Their 2013 paper, published in the journal Rock Art Research, laid out the numbers plainly. The two largest western stones aligned closely with the setting sun at the winter and summer solstices. For this to be coincidence, the odds needed to be calculated carefully, and they were. Norris and Hammaker estimated the probability of all three alignments occurring by chance was low enough to take seriously. It wasn't proof. News of the study spread quickly once it reached the public. Headlines called it Australia's Stonehenge, a comparison that was catchy, if imperfect. If Aboriginal Australians had been tracking solstices with stone alignments, how much older might indigenous astronomical knowledge really be? And why had that possibility never made it into the history books most people grew up reading? To understand why the alignment claim matters, you first need to understand what a solstice actually is. Twice a year, the sun reaches its furthest point north or south along the horizon before reversing direction. Standing at Wurdi Youang and watching the sun set on the winter solstice, an observer looking along the line of the two tallest western stones would see the sun touch the horizon almost exactly between them. On the summer solstice, the same line points to the opposite extreme. That's the core of the claim. The stones don't just sit in a rough oval. Their edges appear to bracket the sun's entire annual range of movement along the horizon. That kind of precision doesn't happen by placing rocks at random. Building a solstice marker isn't a one-afternoon project. You need to watch the sunset shift along the horizon for at least a full year to know where the extremes actually fall. This is precisely why Stonehenge, built and rebuilt over centuries, is considered such an achievement of ancient engineering. If Wurdi Youang really does the same thing with stones instead of towering megaliths, the intellectual achievement is comparable, even if the visual spectacle is smaller. Norris has pointed out that Aboriginal Australians had every reason to track the sun's yearly cycle. Knowing when the seasons would turn meant knowing when specific foods would be available, when animals would migrate, when it was safe or dangerous to travel. Astronomy wasn't abstract. Skeptics of the alignment claim raise a fair point. With enough stones in an arrangement, some are bound to line up with something in the sky purely by chance. Any circle of standing objects has a huge and various number of possible sightlines to test. Norris and Hammaker accounted for this by focusing only on the most prominent stones, the ones that stood out by size and position, the ones a builder would most likely choose to mark something. It's a defensible method, but not a bulletproof one. Other archaeoastronomy claims around the world have collapsed under exactly this kind of scrutiny. Once critics ran the same statistics on random stone piles and found similar alignments by pure coincidence. Wurdi Youang's researchers were aware of this trap and tried to design around it. Even so, no serious researcher on either side claims the case is fully closed. Norris himself has described the alignment as a strong hypothesis worth testing further, not a proven fact. What makes Wurdi Youang different from, say, a random pile of colonial fence-clearing debris is the shape itself. An egg-shaped oval with a clear long axis and specific stones marking its extremes isn't a natural configuration lava or erosion typically produces on its own. Basalt across this part of Victoria did erupt and flow in sheets tens of thousands of years ago, leaving behind naturally fractured boulders scattered across the plain. It's possible to imagine someone selecting from that natural scatter and arranging the pieces deliberately. Compare this to Stonehenge's own trilithons, deliberately shaped and transported from many kilometers away. Wurdi Youang didn't require moving stone across vast distances. Most of its material was likely close at hand. That distinction matters. A monument doesn't need to be monumental in scale to represent monumental knowledge. Dwayne Hammaker has spent much of his career documenting how widespread this kind of sky knowledge was across Aboriginal Australia, long before Wurdi Youang drew international attention. Songs, stories, and ceremonies across dozens of language groups encode detailed astronomical information passed down across generations. In many communities, the position of stars and the timing of their rising or setting were used to schedule ceremonies, track seasonal food sources, and even to navigate across vast, featureless country. This wasn't folklore layered loosely over nature. Seen in that context, a deliberate solar marker at Wurdi Youang isn't an isolated anomaly. It's a physical, static example of a much broader living tradition of sky watching that Aboriginal Australians maintained across the entire continent for tens of thousands of years. That reframing is important because it shifts the story away from one mysterious rock circle and towards something larger, an entire scientific tradition that colonial history simply failed to recognize as science. The stones didn't need to be mysterious. Even the modern survey work at Wurdi Youang was done in close consultation with Wadawurrung representatives, who hold cultural authority over how the site is studied and discussed. Their knowledge of the land's history and their perspective on the site's significance informed how the research was framed. Some traditional knowledge about the site's specific original purpose may never be published or shared publicly, and that is treated as appropriate rather than a gap to be filled by outsiders. Not every question a documentary asks is meant to be answered by a documentary. What can be said, drawing on both survey data and cultural context together, is that Wurdi Youang represents a genuine, still active area of interdisciplinary research. Astronomy, archaeology, and Aboriginal knowledge holders working from different angles toward the same set of questions. Since the 2013 paper, Wurdi Youang has been referenced in international discussions of archaeoastronomy, occasionally alongside far more famous sites like Stonehenge, Newgrange in Ireland, and the Bighorn Medicine Wheel in the United States. It stands as one of the few Southern Hemisphere sites in that conversation at all. That absence is itself worth noting. Archaeoastronomy as a field has historically focused overwhelmingly on Europe and the Americas, in part simply because those regions were studied first and most intensively. If even a fraction of Australia's thousands of recorded stone arrangements hide similar deliberate alignments, most of them have never been surveyed with the level of care Norris and Hammaker applied here. The astronomical case for Wurdi Youang may be the beginning of a much larger investigation, not the end of one. But there is a second question hanging over Wurdi Youang that the alignment study never answered. And it's the question that turned this quiet paddock into an online controversy. How old is it, really? Unlike wood, bone, or charcoal, stone doesn't carry a built-in expiration date that scientists can measure directly. Radiocarbon dating works on organic material that once was alive. This creates an immediate problem for anyone trying to date Wurdi Youang. The stones themselves, the basalt boulders, are the product of volcanic activity that occurred long before any human ever touched them. Geological surveys of the volcanic plains around Melbourne have dated some of the underlying basalt flows in this region to roughly the last ice age, tens of thousands of years old in places. It's tempting to look at that number and assume it applies to the arrangement itself. Online, and in some less careful reporting, that ancient basalt date was sometimes conflated directly with the age of the stone arrangement, producing claims that Wurdi Youang itself was 10,000 years old or more. Mainstream archaeologists have pushed back hard on that leap. The basalt being ancient tells you when the rock formed. It tells you absolutely nothing about when a person picked it up, carried it a short distance, and set it down as part of a deliberate pattern, without an organic layer buried beneath or around the stones. A hearth, a tool, a fragment of charcoal from a campfire used while building it. There is currently no reliable scientific method to directly date when Wurdi Youang's arrangement was actually constructed. That uncomfortable gap is where speculation rushes in. Some enthusiasts online have embraced the highest possible numbers, treating an unproven age as an established fact because it makes for a more dramatic headline. Ray Norris himself has been notably cautious in public statements, emphasizing that the solar alignment hypothesis and any specific extreme age claim are two entirely separate questions. One is testable through careful measurement. Some critics go further, questioning whether the site is ancient at all in any special sense, suggesting it could plausibly date to the 19th or even early 20th century, arranged by Aboriginal people living through the colonial period, using stones cleared from surrounding farmland. That possibility doesn't make the site meaningless. If anything, it raises an equally interesting question. Were Aboriginal communities still actively building and maintaining ceremonial or astronomical stone arrangements well into the era of colonization, quietly continuing a tradition history books assumed had already ended? The honest answer, as of today, is that nobody knows for certain. Not the astronomers, not the archaeologists, and not, in any way that has been made public, the traditional custodians either. That uncertainty isn't a failure of the research. This is a familiar pattern in archaeoastronomy worldwide. Even Stonehenge's precise construction timeline was debated and revised for over a century, with different phases of building now understood to span more than 1,500 years. What's unusual about Wurdi Youang's online reputation is how quickly the uncertainty got flattened into a confident number. 10,000 years old spreads far more easily on social media than the age is currently unknown and may never be precisely determined. That gap between scientific caution and online certainty is worth sitting with, because it cuts both ways. Dismissing Wurdi Youang as unimportant because its age is unconfirmed would be just as much a mistake as declaring it definitively ancient because the headline sounds better that way. Even in the most conservative reading, a solar-aligned stone arrangement built at some point before detailed colonial records began by Aboriginal astronomers using a sophisticated understanding of the sun's yearly path, Wurdi Youang remains a genuinely remarkable structure. It doesn't need an inflated age to matter. The deeper issue, several researchers have argued, isn't really about a specific number of years. It's about why the possibility of Aboriginal astronomical engineering was never seriously investigated for over a century after colonization, while European monuments of comparable ambiguity were studied intensively almost from the start. Stonehenge had teams of archaeologists, surveyors, and now geneticists working on it continuously for well over 150 years. Wurdi Youang had a single rigorous scientific study, published in 2013, after more than a century of being noted only in passing, if at all. That disparity says less about the stones themselves and more about which histories were considered worth the resources to investigate properly. The rocks didn't change, so the real headline may not be a number of years at all. It may simply be this: an entire category of Aboriginal Australian scientific and engineering achievement sat almost unexamined for generations. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because almost no one thought to look. With the astronomy and the age controversy both laid out honestly, it's worth zooming out to the bigger tradition Wurdi Youang belongs to. One written not in stone, but carried unbroken in memory. Long before any stone was placed at Wurdi Youang, Aboriginal Australians had already been living on this continent for an extraordinary span of time. Excavations at Majedbebe, a rock shelter in the Northern Territory, have pushed back confirmed human occupation of Australia to at least 65,000 years. That number makes Aboriginal Australian culture the oldest continuously surviving culture documented anywhere on Earth, by a wide margin. Civilizations most people learn about in school, Egypt, Mesopotamia, even the earliest cities are, by comparison, remarkably recent arrivals. A culture that old had an immense amount of time to observe the sky, refine that knowledge, and pass it down with extraordinary care. Astronomy woven into song and story doesn't fade the way an unmaintained monument does. It survives as long as someone keeps singing it. One of the clearest examples is a constellation most Western astronomy completely overlooks: the Emu in the sky. It isn't made of stars at all, but of the dark spaces between them. Dust clouds in the Milky Way that, from Earth, trace the unmistakable silhouette of a running emu. Dozens of separate Aboriginal language groups across the continent, from the coast to the desert, independently recognized and named the same dark shape. Its position in the sky through the year was used as a practical calendar, signaling when emus were laying eggs and safe to hunt. At certain times of year, the emu appears to be sitting, echoing the posture of an emu on its nest. At other times, its shape shifts and stretches across the sky as the Earth continues its orbit. This is precisely the same intellectual skill the Wurdi Youang alignment hypothesis assumes. Patient, repeated sky watching translated into a lasting physical or cultural marker. The emu in the sky proves that exact skill existed independently, verified, and widely documented across the continent. Aboriginal astronomical knowledge extended well beyond seasonal calendars. Some coastal communities in South Australia carried oral traditions describing land that is now underwater, consistent with sea levels from thousands of years before the present. Sea levels that only rose to today's height after the last ice age ended. Geologists studying post-glacial sea level rise have found that these oral accounts align remarkably well with when specific coastlines would have been submerged. In some cases, over 7,000 years ago. That's an oral history verified independently by physical geology. Traditions describing meteor impacts and possibly the timing of certain volcanic eruptions in what is now Western Victoria, not far from Wurdi Youang itself, have also drawn serious academic interest in recent years. Whether every specific claim holds up to scrutiny, the pattern itself is striking. Long, carefully maintained oral tradition, recited, sung, and retaught across hundreds of generations without writing, turns out to be a far more durable historical record than many written archives assumed possible. It simply required listening to it properly, and for a long time, almost no one did. Seen against this backdrop, Wurdi Youang stops looking like an isolated curiosity and starts looking like one physical anchor point within a much larger, living system of knowledge. The stones may or may not turn out to be as old as basalt beneath them. This is where the show's own premise becomes literal rather than poetic. Aboriginal dreaming, dreamtime, isn't simply mythology in the way that term gets casually used elsewhere. Under that framework, the stones at Wurdi Youang aren't a relic left behind by a vanished people. They belong to a living culture that has never stopped existing, never stopped observing the same horizon, and never fully lost the thread connecting sky, land, and story. That continuity is precisely what most conventional archaeology, built around excavation layers and artifact dating, struggles to fully capture. You can date a hearth. This is also why simply slapping an extreme numerical age onto Wurdi Youang without evidence actually does the site a disservice. It reduces a genuinely profound claim, a living, unbroken tradition of sky knowledge spanning tens of thousands of years, down to a single, unverifiable, and ultimately distracting number. The stronger, better supported story was in front of researchers the entire time. Not a lost super civilization needing rediscovery, but a continuously present one that mainstream history simply failed to study with the same seriousness given to ruins in Egypt or Britain. Duane Hamaker has written that Aboriginal astronomy deserves recognition as one of the world's oldest and most sophisticated sky knowledge systems. Not because of one dramatic number, but because of its documented breadth, its consistency across independent communities, and its unbroken living transmission. That framing doesn't require exaggeration to be remarkable. It only requires taking seriously what was already being said by the people who had been saying it the entire time, long before any astronomer arrived with a measuring instrument. With that broader tradition in view, we can return to the paddock outside Melbourne and to the question of what happens to Wurdi Youang now that people are finally paying attention. Today, Wurdi Youang is listed on the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Register, giving it legal protection against disturbance or development. Public access is deliberately limited, partly to protect the fragile arrangement and partly at the request of Wadawurrung representatives who manage how the site is engaged with. That restriction sometimes frustrates curious visitors, hoping to walk among the stones freely. But it reflects a broader shift already underway, treating the site first as a living cultural and spiritual place, and only secondarily as a subject for outside research or tourism. Ongoing collaboration between researchers like Norris and Hamaker and Wadavaran knowledge holders continues, though not every detail of that work is made public by design. Some knowledge is shared for study. Further scientific study is still technically possible. Ground-penetrating radar, more precise stone surveys, careful searches for any buried organic material nearby that might finally offer a real date. None of that work is guaranteed to happen quickly or at all. Every year without that additional evidence, the age of Wurdi Youang remains an open question rather than a settled fact. For a culture built on patience across tens of thousands of years, waiting a little longer for a definitive answer is, in some sense, entirely appropriate. What's already certain, regardless of the exact date, is this. Colonial Australia spent more than a century treating a potential astronomical monument as scattered rubble, simply because of who built it. That is not a footnote to the story. The same pattern repeats worldwide in different forms, wherever colonial history intersected with indigenous engineering, astronomy, and architecture. Achievements were routinely reattributed to lost outsiders, dismissed as accident or simply never investigated, because the assumption was that such sophistication couldn't have originated locally. Wurdi Youang is a rare case where that assumption is now being actively corrected in real time by scientists willing to ask a very simple question. What if this was built on purpose? It took roughly 150 years for anyone with the right tools to ask it seriously. The stones haven't moved. The sunset still touches the same points on the horizon it did on the day, whenever that day was, that someone first stood here and decided to mark it. That's the real theme running through this entire investigation, from the colonial surveys to the 2013 astronomy paper to the still unresolved question of age. Evidence of extraordinary knowledge was present the entire time. It's worth remembering that the Watharong and broader Wadavaran community never needed a peer-reviewed paper to know their ancestors were sophisticated observers of the sky. That knowledge was never lost to them. When Ray Norris first proposed his hypothesis, he reportedly noted that if the same stone pattern had been found in England or Egypt, it likely would have been studied intensively decades earlier. In Australia, it sat quietly in a paddock for well over a century instead. That single observation says as much about the history of archaeology itself as it does about Wurdi Youang. The stones were always here, doing exactly what they may have always done at every sunset, waiting for someone to notice the pattern. As research continues, it's entirely possible that new evidence could push the confirmed history of the site back significantly, or could confirm a much more recent construction date. Either outcome would still leave the core discovery intact, a functioning solar marker built by careful, patient observation. What began as a scattering of rocks in a colonial survey file has become one of the more compelling case studies in how deeply history can misjudge what it doesn't bother to study closely. Wurdi Youang may never draw Stonehenge's crowds. Its significance was never really about matching a more famous monument stone for stone. It was about recognizing that the same kind of careful, patient, generational knowledge that built Stonehenge also existed here, on this continent, watched by different eyes, under a different sky. The history books that left this out weren't necessarily lying. They were simply written by people who never thought to ask the right question, in the right place, of the right knowledge holders. Every sunset at Wurdi Youang is, in a sense, a small live demonstration of whatever knowledge shaped this place. Proof that requires no excavation, no laboratory, no carbon isotope. You only need to be standing in the right spot, at the right moment, looking west. Whether that moment was first marked 10,000 years ago, 300 years ago, or somewhere in between, the deeper story doesn't change. This land has never stopped being watched, measured, and understood by the people who belong to it. That's the real reason this stone arrangement outside Melbourne deserves far more attention than a quiet paddock usually gets. Not because it might be older than Egypt's pyramids, that claim remains unproven, but because it was never given a fair chance to be studied at all until recently. Wurdi Youang is only one entry point into a much larger, still unfolding story of Australia's ancient past. One built on volcanic soil, aquaculture systems older than the pyramids, and oral histories that remember the sea rising. In the next episode, we follow that story to a 6,000-year-old fish trap that quietly rewrites the history of engineering itself.